My son raised a champagne glass in downtown Boise and told a room full of investors he had built everything on his own. Funny thing is, 3 days earlier, at exactly 9:14 Monday morning, I had become his landlord without him even knowing it. 5-year lease, $6,800 a month. Personal guarantee buried on page 17. He didn't invite me to the celebration, by the way. You know that look people get when they think they've finally outgrown where they came from? Ethan had that look all over his face, and I just stood there in my old gray flannel, holding the keys to the building he thought belonged to somebody else. But to understand why I stayed quiet that long, you need to understand what kind of son Ethan had slowly become. Before we get into this story, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy real family drama stories with truth, heartbreak, and hard-earned lessons, go ahead and subscribe. We've got plenty more coming. I've lived in Spokane, Washington for almost 40 years now, which is long enough for a man to become part of the weather, whether he means to or not. People recognize my truck before they recognize me. A faded silver 1999 Ford Ranger with one stubborn dent above the rear tire and a tailgate that only closes properly if you lift it slightly first. Leon Ramirez says that truck sounds like an old smoker climbing church stairs every winter morning, and honestly, he's not wrong. I live in a small one-story house on South Hill, about 12 minutes from downtown, if traffic behaves itself. White siding, green trim Maggie picked out in 2004 because she said plain white houses made her feel like she was living inside a refrigerator. After she passed 3 years ago, I never changed a thing. Even the little ceramic sunflower by the porch is still crooked because she glued it that way herself after dropping it during a barbecue. Funny the things grief preserves. Every Friday morning at 7:15, I go to Frank's Diner near Hamilton Street. Same booth, same order, 2 eggs over medium hash browns, extra crispy rye toast dry, because I'm old enough now that my doctor and I negotiate over butter like international diplomats. That's usually where Leon finds me. Leon Ramirez is 71 years old, built like a retired refrigerator repairman, because that's exactly what he was. Thick gray mustache, bad knees, laughs loud enough to startle children, owns a tiny auto garage off Sprague Avenue where he mostly argues with carburetors and listens to Mariners games on a radio older than some marriages. Leon walked into Frank's that Friday wearing a flannel jacket with grease stains shaped suspiciously like Texas. "You look terrible," he told me. "That's just aging." "No," he said, sliding into the booth. "Aging is slower. You look immediate. Now, I need you to understand something. Men our age don't really say, 'I'm worried about you.' We insult each other like raccoons fighting behind a dumpster, and somehow that counts as emotional support." So I smiled. "You still owe me $40 from poker night," I told him. Leon pointed at me with his coffee mug. "See that right there? That's the face of a man hiding something." Maybe he was right, because even before all this happened with Ethan, something had already started changing between us years earlier. Slowly, quietly, like a hairline crack under paint. Ethan was always smart, scary smart sometimes. At 12 years old, he figured out how to flip old gaming consoles online for profit before I even understood what PayPal was. At 16, he was talking about market positioning while the rest of us were still trying to figure out why the Wi-Fi router blinked at night. But Ethan hated feeling ordinary. That's the best way I can explain it. He hated old things, cheap things, anything that reminded him we were middle-class people surviving carefully instead of rich people living freely. Especially me. When he was 15, I drove him to a debate tournament at Lewis and Clark High School wearing my old brown work jacket because it was freezing outside. He got out of the truck and then leaned back through the passenger window real fast. "Dad," he whispered. "What? Could you park farther away?" And you'll remember laughing because I honestly thought he was joking. "I'm serious." He looked embarrassed, even saying it. That truck is loud. Buddy, when your child becomes ashamed of your muffler before your personality, that's how you know American culture is doing cardio on everybody's self-worth. I parked farther away. Didn't argue. That's one thing parents don't tell you. Sometimes heartbreak arrives in tiny installments, not dramatic betrayals, not screaming matches, just little moments where someone you love starts editing you out of the picture. Maggie noticed it too. She always noticed things before I did. My wife had this quiet, emotional intelligence that made everybody around her feel slightly transparent. She worked 26 years as a nurse at Providence Sacred Heart Medical Center and somehow still came home gentle after dealing with humanity at its absolute worst. One night after Ethan left for college in Seattle, she stood at the kitchen sink, drying dishes, and said something I still think about. He runs ahead of himself. I looked up from the newspaper. "What does that mean?" "He's scared," she said. "Of what?" She shrugged a little. "Becoming us." That sentence sat in the room like smoke. Now listen, I never blamed Ethan for wanting more. God knows I wanted more at his age too. Better neighborhoods, better schools, less worrying every time the transmission made a new sound. But somewhere along the way, Ethan started treating struggle like contamination, like our ordinary life was something he needed to disinfect himself from. After Maggie died, things got stranger. He called less, visited less. Every conversation sounded rushed, like he was squeezing me between calendar notifications. You know that tone people use when they're technically listening, but emotionally halfway inside another room already. That became Ethan's voice. Still, I defended him constantly. To Leon, to neighbors, to myself. He's busy. He's building something. He's under pressure. Parents become magicians that way. We can turn neglect into explanations faster than Las Vegas professionals. Around late October, Spokane started getting that cold, wet wind that sneaks under your sleeves no matter what you wear. I was in my garage changing the oil in the Ranger when I found one of Maggie's old gardening gloves shoved behind a shelf. Tiny thing, purple fabric, dirt still trapped in the seams. And for about 30 seconds, I just stood there, holding it. That's grief too, by the way. Not big movie speeches, just freezing in your own garage because someone's glove still exists. Then my phone rang. "Ethan." I wiped my hands on a shop rag before answering. "Hey, kid." His voice came through too cheerful, too polished. "Hey, Dad, you got a minute?" And right there, before he even asked for anything, I knew money was about to enter the conversation. Adult children have a special tone when they need financial help, but want to sound independent while requesting it. It's somewhere between a business pitch an emotional hostage negotiation. I leaned against the workbench. Sure, I said. What's going on? There was a pause. Then Ethan said the sentence that started this entire mess. So, I'm opening a new business in Boise. Now I want you to pay attention to this next part carefully, because this is where people usually misunderstand fathers like me. When Ethan called asking for money, I already knew two things. First, he absolutely needed help. Second, he would rather swallow a flashlight than admit that out loud. You could hear it in his breathing. So it's this hybrid concept, he said, slipping into what I assume he thought was his professional voice. Artisan coffee shop downstairs, collaborative workspace upstairs, private event, loft in the back. Boise's exploding right now, Dad. Everybody's moving there. I leaned against the garage workbench while rain tapped softly against the side door. It's called Forge and Pine Collective. Now listen, if you're under 40, maybe that sounds impressive. To me, it sounded like a candle company owned by people who drink sparkling water aggressively. Still, I kept listening. Ethan started talking faster. That was always his tell when he got excited. He explained how the building sat near downtown Boise, close to restaurants and tech offices and luxury apartments full of people who apparently pay $16 for coffee because somebody drew a leaf in the foam. He talked about investors, brand identity, growth scaling, community culture. I understood maybe 60% of the words and 90% of the desperation underneath them. Then he got quieter. So we hit a temporary liquidity issue. There it was. Not I need money. Not can you help me? Temporary liquidity issue. Corporate language is amazing. You can wrap panic in enough vocabulary, and suddenly it sounds like strategy. How temporary? I asked. A pause. 42,000. I closed my eyes. Not because I was angry, because that's a very specific amount of money. Specific numbers mean specific problems. What happened? Construction delays mostly. Another pause. You know how permits are? Oh, I knew exactly how permits were. I spent 32 years doing commercial property due diligence for regional banks across Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. My entire career was basically listening to optimistic people explain why paperwork shouldn't matter. Paperwork always matters. Always. I rolled the wrench slowly across the workbench with one finger. Who's the landlord? Ethan exhaled through his nose immediately, annoyed already. Dad, who owns the building? It's under an investment group. What group? It's complicated. No. See right there. That's the sentence that makes old property men sit up straight. Complicated ownership means hidden problems. I asked another question. How long's the lease? 5 years. Personal guarantee. Silence. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. But trust me, 2 seconds can sound like church bells if you know what you're listening for. Partial. I stared at the rain sliding down the garage window. You signed a personal guarantee. It's standard. Standard for people with leverage. Do you have leverage? His tone sharpened immediately. This isn't like the stuff you used to do at the bank, Dad. There it was. That little edge. That subtle embarrassment. like my entire career belonged in a museum next to rotary telephones and ration books. I kept my voice calm. What does that mean? It means business is different now. Buildings still collapse if the math's wrong. He laughed once, short, irritated. Jesus, Dad, this is exactly why I didn't want to get into all this. You know that feeling when someone asks for your help while simultaneously insulting the life experience that could save them? That feeling right there. But I stayed quiet because under the arrogance, I heard something else. Fear, real fear. And fear makes people cruel sometimes, especially ambitious people. So I asked him the question that mattered most. How underwater are you? Another silence. Then finally, if I can cover payroll and final contractor payments, we'll stabilize. We, my partners. That word bothered me instantly. Partners. People who disappear first when invoices start hunting for blood. I walked over to the old cabinet near the freezer where Maggie used to keep paperwork in labeled manila folders. Insurance forms, tax receipts, birthday cards she refused to throw away. After she died, I found an envelope tucked between two photo albums for Ethan someday. That was written in her handwriting. Inside was money she'd quietly built over years working overtime shifts at the hospital. Not millions. Maggie and I were never rich, but enough that if Ethan truly needed help someday, he'd have a softer landing than we ever did. I remember sitting on the bedroom floor, holding that envelope and crying harder than I had at the funeral. Because even after death, that woman was still trying to protect people. I opened the cabinet while Ethan kept talking about investor confidence and launch momentum. The envelope was still there. I need you to understand something important. I did not give Ethan that money because I trusted his business plan. I gave it to him because he was my son. There's a difference. How fast do you need it? I asked quietly. His entire tone changed. Relief flooded straight through the phone. Really? How fast? By Friday would save us. Us again. Always dangerous. I sat down on the old wooden stool beside my toolbox. I'll wire it tomorrow. For a second, he sounded 12 years old again. Thank you, Dad. That almost broke me right there. Almost. Then he ruined it. I mean, this isn't really an investment. It's more temporary support while things scale. Now, maybe that sounds small to you, but parents notice wording, temporary support, not partnership, not involvement, not family, just financial oxygen delivered quietly through the side door so his real life could continue uninterrupted. I nodded to myself slowly. Got it. You know I'll pay you back. You don't need to say that. No, seriously. He started talking again, excitement returning now that the crisis was solved. He described reclaimed wood counters and matte black fixtures in something called intentional atmosphere, which honestly sounded like a polite way to describe dim lighting. I let him talk, because sometimes lonely fathers let conversations continue long after the important part is over. Before hanging up, I asked one last question. When's the opening? Oh, still finalizing that. Something about the answer felt slippery, but I ignored it. That was my mistake. The next morning, I drove downtown Spokane to Riverbank Credit Union wearing jeans, work boots, and my old Seahawks cap. The young teller helping me looked about 19 years old and called me sweetie 4 separate times while transferring $42,000 into Ethan's business account. I wanted to tell her I used to review commercial loan files larger than her apartment complex. Instead, I just smiled politely, like retired men do. On the drive home, Leon called. "You want to fish?" "Sunday, can't." "Why, I just financed a coffee shop, apparently." Leon laughed so hard I had to pull over near Division Street because I started laughing too. "You," he wheezed. "Mr. Instant Coffee himself. It has collaborative energy," I said seriously. "What the hell does that mean?" "No idea." We laughed another minute before the silence settled softer between us. Then Leon asked quietly, "You trust him?" That question stayed in the truck long after the call ended, because the truth was complicated. I trusted Ethan to work hard. I trusted Ethan to dream big. I trusted Ethan to survive. But trust him completely, I wasn't sure anymore. And deep down, somewhere beneath all the pride and denial and fatherly excuses, I think I already knew trouble was coming. I just didn't know my son was about to erase me from the story entirely. 2 weeks passed after I wired Ethan the money. Not a single update. No photos. No thanks again. Nothing. Now, before anybody starts yelling in the comments about how adult children get busy, let me stop you right there. I know that. I'm old, not stupid. People have jobs, relationships, lives. But there's a difference between being busy and becoming professionally unavailable to your own family. Ethan had mastered that difference. The weather in Spokane turned colder by the day. Around late November, the mornings started arriving dark and wet with that northwest drizzle that never fully commits to becoming rain. I spent most afternoons in the garage replacing the Ranger's brake pads because apparently I enjoy unnecessary suffering. That Thursday night around 11:40 p.m., I was sitting in my recliner, half watching a rerun of some home renovation show where beautiful people cry over countertop colors. I had Maggie's old knitted blanket over my legs and a bowl of grocery store chili balanced on my stomach. Real, glamorous stuff. My laptop buzzed on the side table. Normally, I ignore notifications after 10 because at my age, every unknown sound feels medically suspicious. But something told me to look. It was Facebook. Specifically, one of those people you may know, suggestions that somehow knows more about your family than your family does. And there he was, Ethan Butler, smiling in front of a matte black brick building with giant industrial windows and a glowing white sign that read, "Forge and Pine Collective, Grand Opening, Investor Brunch Thursday, 11 a.m., downtown." Boise underneath the post, Ethan had written, "Built from the ground up with incredible people who believed in the vision." I read that sentence 3 times. You ever feel pain that arrives so quietly you almost miss it? That because I wasn't looking for praise. I wasn't expecting a statue. But $42,000 isn't emotional confetti. And neither are 30 years of fatherhood. I scrolled farther. Photos of exposed brick walls, leather chairs, pendant lighting, a custom espresso bar. One picture showed Ethan standing beside Claire Whitmore, wearing a navy blazer I'd never seen before. Claire had one hand on his chest while they smiled at a group of investors holding champagne glasses. Everybody looked polished, expensive, intentional, like one of those magazine articles about young innovators transforming urban culture. And nowhere in the entire post was there any sign I existed. No mention, no tag, no invitation, nothing. I leaned back slowly in the recliner and stared at the ceiling fan turning overhead. You know what hurt most? It wasn't the money. It was realizing Ethan had carefully constructed a version of success that did not include the people who carried him there. That takes effort. Editing somebody out takes planning. About 10 minutes later, my phone rang. Leon. I answered immediately, because Leon only calls late if he's either drunk injured or emotionally curious. Why are you awake? I asked. You sound depressed, he replied. That wasn't an answer. I microwaved lasagna too long, and now my kitchen smells like war crimes. Fair enough. He kept talking while I stared at Ethan's smiling face on the laptop screen. Then Leon paused. What's wrong? I hesitated. Then I turned the laptop toward myself again, like somehow the story might change the second time. My son opened his business. That's good. I wasn't invited. Silence. Not awkward silence. Heavy silence. The kind old friends allow each other. Leon finally sighed. Oh, Garrett. Now listen to me carefully here. There are people in life who try to solve your pain immediately. They rush in with advice and optimism and motivational nonsense because your sadness makes them uncomfortable. Leon wasn't like that. He just sat in the silence with you. That's rarer than people think. He probably assumed you were busy, Leon offered weakly, at 11 on a Thursday night. Okay. Yeah, that's stupid. I laughed once despite myself. Leon said, Stay there. I'm coming over. You don't have to. I already put pants on. Don't waste the miracle. 25 minutes later, his old Chevy Suburban rattled into my driveway sounding like loose silverware in a dryer. He walked in carrying a huckleberry pie from a bakery off Monroe Street. Well, he announced, if your family disappoints you, carbohydrates remain loyal. That man should have been a therapist. Unfortunately, the universe apparently hates dignity because while climbing my porch steps, Leon slipped slightly and dropped half the pie upside down near the welcome mat. We both stared at it, purple filling everywhere. Cold night air, two old men frozen over a pastry tragedy. Then Leon muttered, This feels symbolic. And I laughed so hard I had to lean against the doorframe. Real laughter, too. The painful kind that surprises you after grief has made your ribs feel rusted shut. We ended up eating the surviving half of the pie in my kitchen at nearly 1 a.m, while Leon insulted Boise coffee culture like it had personally stolen his wallet. $6 espresso, he grumbled. Garrett, if coffee starts requiring a business model, civilization is over. I shook my head, smiling. You're just mad because your garage coffee tastes like transmission fluid. It builds character or liver damage. For a little while, things felt normal again. Warm, human. Then Leon noticed the laptop still open. He looked at Ethan's post quietly. That your money? I nodded once. Leon squinted at the screen. No offense, Garrett, but your son dresses like he says words like synergy during intimacy. I nearly choked on coffee. You can't say things like that in my kitchen? I absolutely can. But eventually, the joking faded. Because underneath it all sat something ugly neither of us wanted to say out loud. Ethan wasn't just distancing himself from me. He was embarrassed by where he came from. And that cuts differently when it's your child. Around 1:30 a.m., Leon finally stood to leave. Before walking out, he put a hand on my shoulder. "You gonna confront him?" I looked back toward the laptop screen, toward Ethan's perfect smiling photos, toward strangers congratulating him for building something from nothing. "I don't know yet." Leon nodded slowly. Then his eyes narrowed slightly. "Wait. What?" He leaned closer to the screen. "What's the address?" I looked. 412 West Idaho Street. The second I read it, something in my brain shifted. Not emotionally, professionally, like an old machine sputtering back to life after years unplugged. Because I knew that building, or at least I knew the block. And suddenly, I wasn't thinking like a hurt father anymore. I was thinking like the man regional banks used to call whenever commercial ownership paperwork smelled even slightly dishonest. I sat up straighter. Leon noticed immediately. "Oh no," he said softly. "What?" "That face." "What face?" "The one you used to get before somebody lost a lawsuit." I kept staring at the address. 412 West Idaho Street, downtown Boise. And somewhere deep beneath the heartbreak, something old and dangerous inside me quietly woke up. I almost closed the laptop and let the whole thing go. Almost. Then I opened a new browser tab and started searching property records. There are certain instincts you never really lose, like riding a bicycle, or knowing when milk smells wrong, or recognizing a commercial property deal held together with optimism and dental floss. The second I saw the address, 412 West Idaho Street, something old inside my brain clicked awake like fluorescent lights in an abandoned office building. I knew that block. Not personally, professionally. Back when I worked commercial due diligence for Cascade Regional Bank, Boise exploded with redevelopment projects every few years. Investors bought old brick warehouses downtown, renamed them things like industrial creative hubs, and charged young professionals monthly rent equivalent to a minor hostage negotiation. My job was to look past the fancy language. Everybody in commercial real estate lies a little. Developers lie optimistically. Banks lie carefully. Investors lie confidently. And tenants lie desperately. The trick is figuring out who's lying dangerously. I sat at my kitchen table until almost 3 in the morning with my reading glasses sliding down my nose and county property records open across 4 browser tabs like some kind of exhausted legal raccoon. Leon had already gone home by then, but not before pointing at me and saying, "Garrett, whatever expression you've got right now." That's how detectives look before bodies get discovered. I waved him off. But honestly, he wasn't completely wrong. The ownership records for 412 West Idaho were messy. Very messy. The building officially belonged to a holding company called Aldercrest Commercial Partners, LLC, which immediately annoyed me because companies with names like that are usually hiding either debt lawsuits or emotionally unstable accountants. Sometimes all three. I kept digging. The tax filings showed late payments twice within 18 months. Then I found something interesting. A uniform commercial code lien filed 6 months earlier by a private lender out of Salt Lake City. Now stay with me here because this matters. A UCC lien is basically paperwork that says, if this whole thing catches fire financially, we get first dibs on whatever survives. Healthy properties rarely accumulate those casually. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Ethan, I muttered to myself, what did you sign? Outside Spokane, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows while the microwave clock glowed 3:11 a.m. in cheap green numbers. And that's when I saw the transfer notice. Pending ownership movement. Not finalized yet. Pending. That word changed everything. I opened another document, then another, and another. The building wasn't stable at all. The current ownership group was liquidating assets fast because of pressure from unpaid commercial obligations tied to another failed project in Meridian. Meaning what? Meaning Ethan had signed a long-term commercial lease inside a building whose ownership situation was wobbling like folding chairs at a church potluck. Now listen carefully. This is where younger people sometimes misunderstand older men. Age doesn't automatically make you wiser, but surviving enough bad situations does make you recognize patterns faster. And I recognized this one immediately. Ethan had fallen in love with the dream before checking the foundation underneath it. Classic mistake. Expensive mistake. Potentially catastrophic mistake. The next morning, I skipped Frank's diner entirely and drove straight downtown to the Spokane County Library because their business research database access is better than most people realize. Also, because old men love free resources with unreasonable passion. I spent 4 straight hours tracing ownership entities and financing structures while drinking burnt vending machine coffee that tasted like sadness filtered through cardboard. By noon, I had a clearer picture, and the clearer the picture became, the less angry I felt. That probably sounds strange, but anger is emotional. This had started becoming mathematical. There's a dangerous calm that settles over people who used to solve problems professionally. Your feelings move aside, and training takes over. I hadn't felt that in years, not since retirement. Around 1:20 p.m., I called someone I hadn't spoken to in almost 8 years. Vanessa Cole. She answered on the third ring. Treasure Valley title and escrow. This is Vanessa. Her voice sounded exactly the same. Sharp. Efficient. Like she alphabetized her spices recreationally. Vanessa Cole, I said. If this isn't the most terrifyingly competent woman in Idaho. Silence. Then suddenly, Garrett Butler. I smiled despite myself. Still alive. Well, I'll be damned. Now, Vanessa and I had worked together on dozens of commercial property reviews back in the early 2000s. She was one of the few title officers I genuinely trusted, which in commercial real estate is basically the emotional equivalent of naming someone in your will. You retired old enough yet? She asked. I tried. Turns out I'm bad at hobbies. She laughed softly. So what kind of trouble are you sniffing around now? Straight to business. That's why I liked her. I gave her the address. There was a pause, then keyboard clicking, more silence. Finally, oh, that one word told me everything. You seeing what I'm seeing? I asked. Potentially worse. I rubbed my forehead slowly. Thought so. Vanessa lowered her voice slightly. Garrett, why are you looking at this property? Now here's the thing. I could have lied, could have said I was consulting, could have said an old client asked questions. Instead, I stared out the library window at the gray Spokane afternoon and told the truth. My son leased space there. Another pause. A softer one this time. Oh no. Exactly. Vanessa explained the current ownership entity was under pressure to unload quickly before additional legal exposure surfaced tied to unrelated commercial debt restructuring. Translation. The building could potentially change hands very fast. Potentially cheap, too. That word sat quietly in my chest. Cheap. I asked a few more questions, then one very specific question. If someone wanted controlling ownership clean and fast, could it still happen before tenant notifications finalize? Vanessa went silent. You know that silence professionals use when they realize another professional just had an idea? That silence. Garrett, she said carefully, what exactly are you thinking? Honestly, at first I didn't fully know myself. Revenge, protection, control, maybe all three. But underneath everything sat one undeniable fact. My son had entered a dangerous commercial agreement without understanding the people above him. And unfortunately for Ethan, understanding hidden ownership structures was the one thing I had spent 3 decades doing better than almost anybody. I drove home through cold Spokane traffic, feeling strangely calm. Not happy, not vindictive, focused. When I pulled into my driveway, Leon was waiting beside the garage, holding 2 gas station hot dogs and looking deeply suspicious. I had a feeling you were doing something irresponsible, he announced. You brought emergency hot dogs. I support chaos nutritionally. We sat on overturned paint buckets in the garage while I explained the situation. Leon listened quietly. For once, no jokes. When I finally finished, he whistled low. So your kid signed a lease in a building that might change ownership underneath him. Mm-hmm. And you think you can buy it? Maybe. Leon stared at me for a long moment. Then he asked the question I'd been avoiding myself. You trying to save him or teach him? I looked down at the concrete floor. That was the problem. I wasn't completely sure anymore. Because somewhere between the missing invitation and the hidden embarrassment and the lies about building everything himself, something inside me had finally gotten tired of being treated like background furniture in my own family. Still, I knew one thing clearly. I didn't want to destroy Ethan. I wanted him to stop lying before the world punished him harder than I ever could. And if I was being honest, part of me wanted him to understand exactly who his father really was. By Friday afternoon, I wasn't angry anymore. That's usually when people should start worrying. The drive from Spokane to Boise takes a little over 7 hours if your knees cooperate and you don't make unnecessary stops for beef jerky or existential reflection. Unfortunately, at 68, I'm vulnerable to both. I left before sunrise on a Sunday morning with a thermos of black coffee in the cup holder and an old Eagles CD rattling around somewhere beneath the passenger seat. The Ranger complained the entire way down Interstate 84 like it deeply opposed interstate travel on moral grounds. The farther south I drove, the emptier the landscape became. Cold November fields, long stretches of gray highway, gas stations with names like Valley Fuel and Deli, where the coffee tastes like it was filtered through roofing shingles. I've always liked road trips, though. There's something honest about them. No notifications, no presentations, no branding language, just asphalt and time. About halfway through Oregon, Ethan called. Perfect timing. I answered through the truck speakers. "How's Boise?" I asked. "Busy," he said immediately. That one-word answer told me he was distracted already, or pretending to be. I could hear restaurant noise in the background. Silverware. Voices. Expensive echo. Probably one of those downtown places where everybody orders appetizers using adjectives. "You sound tired," I said. "Yeah, we're slammed, getting ready for Thursday." Thursday. The brunch. Still no invitation. I kept my voice even. Everything on track, mostly. That word again. Mostly. I merged around a semi-truck while rain streaked across the windshield. "You ever hear from the landlord after the wiring issue?" I asked casually. A slight pause. "Nope. All handled." "Interesting. Handled usually means hidden." I could practically hear Ethan walking while talking. "Dad, listen. I may be hard to reach this week." We've got investors flying in. Media stuff. Local business people. Sounds important. It is important." There was that tone again. That subtle defensiveness ambitious people get when they think someone might minimize their success. I almost told him the truth right there. Almost said, "Actually, son, your building ownership is unstable and your lease structure is dangerous. And I'm currently driving toward Idaho to potentially become your landlord." But I didn't, because I needed to see the entire picture first. And maybe, if I'm being painfully honest, part of me wanted Ethan to keep underestimating me a little longer. "You proud of me? At least?" he asked suddenly. That caught me off guard. The question sounded younger than the rest of him. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "Of course I am." Silence. Then softer. "Okay." For a moment, I heard my real son again underneath the businessman costume. Then somebody in the background called his name. "Gotta run," Ethan said quickly. And just like that, he disappeared again. I drove another 3 hours thinking about that tiny crack in his voice. Because that's the hard part. Nobody talks about. People are rarely one thing completely. Ethan wasn't a monster. He was insecure. And insecure people will sometimes sacrifice honesty if they think success can finally make them feel safe. By the time I reached Boise, the sun had already started dropping behind the buildings downtown, painting the streets gold and orange. Boise surprised me the first time I visited years ago. Cleaner than people expect. Busy without feeling frantic. Expensive in that polished, new money kind of way. Forge and Pine sat exactly where the record said it would. 412 West Idaho Street. I parked across the street and just looked at it for a while. Tall industrial windows, black steel framing, warm amber lights inside. The place looked beautiful. That hurt too, because for a second, I could see exactly why Ethan fell in love with the dream. Young employees moved tables around inside while somebody tested music through hidden speakers. A woman carried a crate of wine bottles through the front entrance, laughing into her phone. Everybody looked hopeful. That's the tragedy of bad business decisions sometimes. They often begin surrounded by excitement. I stayed there maybe 15 minutes before driving to the hotel Vanessa recommended. The Boise Motor Lodge looked like the kind of place recently divorced accountants stay while finding themselves. Brown carpet, tiny coffee machine. Ice bucket, nobody trusts. Perfect. The next morning, I met Vanessa Cole at Treasure Valley Title and Escrow downtown. She looked almost exactly how I remembered. Sharp navy, blazer, dark hair tied back neatly. Reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck like she personally disciplined paperwork for fun. The second she saw me, she smiled. "Well," she said, standing to hug me lightly, "you still look like a man who argues with printers." "I do," I admitted. "Frequently." Vanessa led me into a small conference room with glass walls and stacks of property files organized in terrifyingly neat piles. Then she slid a folder toward me. Inside sat everything I expected. Ownership instability. Distress transfer potential. Pending obligations. And most importantly, timing. The building could still be acquired before full tenant notification finalized through the restructuring process. Meaning, Ethan had absolutely no idea the ground underneath him was moving. Vanessa folded her hands carefully. "You really thinking about doing this?" I looked down at the paperwork. You know what the funny part is? If Ethan had just invited me honestly into this thing, none of this would even be happening. And that was true. I need you to understand that. This was never about money first. It was about humiliation, about becoming invisible to your own child. Vanessa studied me quietly. "You planning to evict him?" I looked up immediately. "No." And I meant that. I wasn't trying to destroy Ethan's business. Despite everything, I still wanted him to succeed. I just didn't trust the people around him. And after seeing the lease terms, I trusted Ethan's judgment even less. The lease was brutal. 5 years, personal guarantee clause, late payment penalties, disclosure language broad enough to create legal exposure if investor information proved inaccurate. Ethan had signed it anyway, probably because somebody in a fitted blazer told him it was industry standard. God help me, young entrepreneurs will sign anything if you serve it beside reclaimed wood tables. Vanessa eventually asked the real question. "You financing personally?" I nodded slowly. Part savings, part old investment accounts, and part of Maggie's bonds. That part sat heavy in my chest, because those bonds were supposed to become safety someday. Maybe medical bills, maybe retirement security. Instead, I was about to use them to buy partial control over my son's collapsing illusion. Life gets weird after 60. Around 2:45 that afternoon, Vanessa walked me through final acquisition structures under Butler Basin Holdings, LLC, an old inactive entity I'd kept alive mostly because closing it felt annoying. Funny how laziness occasionally becomes strategy. By 3:47 p.m. Monday, the deed transfer officially recorded. I stared at the timestamp on the document for a long moment. Done. Just like that. After decades of ordinary fatherhood and silent sacrifices and ignored phone calls and missing invitations, I had become Ethan Butler's landlord. And he had absolutely no idea. Vanessa closed the folder gently. "Well," she said carefully, "that's one way to reconnect with family." I laughed despite myself, but underneath the humor sat something colder. because now came the dangerous part: waiting. The ribbon-cutting brunch was Thursday morning. And between Monday afternoon and Thursday, my son was going to continue standing proudly inside a building he believed belonged to strangers, not knowing the man he was most ashamed of now held the keys. The strange thing about holding power over someone is that you suddenly notice how casually they expose themselves when they think you're harmless. That entire week, Ethan kept talking to me like I was retired furniture. Not maliciously. Almost worse than that. Absent-mindedly. Tuesday morning, I was back in Spokane sitting at my kitchen table, eating toast, hard enough to qualify as building material, when Ethan called again. He sounded energized, fast, bright, like a man running on caffeine and validation. "Dad, you should see this place right now," he said. "We've got floral installs coming in, local food vendors, investor packets. The Boise Chamber people confirmed too. That's good. And there's this regional business magazine sending a photographer." I could practically hear him smiling. You know what's dangerous about ambition? It rewards performance before wisdom. That's why young people mistake momentum for stability all the time. Ethan kept talking for almost 15 minutes without asking a single question about me. Not one. Not, "How was your drive?" Not, "How are you doing since Mom's anniversary passed?" Not even, "Did you get home okay?" Just business, growth, image, expansion. At one point, he actually said, "We're positioning Forge and Pine as a scalable hospitality ecosystem." Now, I spent 32 years around commercial developers, and I'm here to tell you that anytime somebody uses the word ecosystem outside a rainforest, somebody's probably lying to investors. I stirred sweetener into my coffee slowly. "You sleeping at all?" I asked. A short laugh. "Sleep's for employees." That line bothered me more than he realized, because Maggie used to say something similar before burnout nearly wrecked her health in her 40s. People who joke proudly about exhaustion usually believe collapse is a personality trait. Still, I kept my tone light. "So this Thursday thing sounds pretty serious." "It is." Another pause. Then Ethan added carefully, "It's mostly for investors and business connections, though. Pretty formal." There it was. The non-invitation invitation. The polite exclusion. He wanted me to understand I wasn't supposed to come without having to say it directly. I stared out the kitchen window at the wet Spokane morning while a squirrel committed crimes against my bird feeder. "Got it," I said calmly. "You understand, right?" And because human beings are complicated disasters, part of me still wanted to protect him even then. That's the embarrassing truth. Even after everything, I still found myself trying to make excuses for him inside my own head. He's stressed. He's overwhelmed. He doesn't mean it personally. But another voice kept answering back. Then why does it keep feeling personal? Later that afternoon, I drove over to Leon's garage because sitting alone with your thoughts after becoming your son's secret landlord is medically unwise. Leon was underneath a lifted Chevy Tahoe when I walked in. All you could see were boots and profanity. "You alive under there?" I asked. "No," he replied. "Tell my ex-wife she was right about everything." I sat on an overturned bucket while he rolled himself out on the mechanic's creeper, holding a wrench and what looked like spiritual exhaustion. "You look smug," he said immediately. I don't. You absolutely do. That's your I know something expensive face. I laughed softly. Then my phone buzzed. Email notification from Claire Whitmore. Now, at first, I assumed it had been sent intentionally. Claire and I had always gotten along reasonably well. She was polished, but kind. The sort of person who says thank you to waiters without performing it for social media. Subject line: Final investor materials. Thursday. I frowned, then opened it, and immediately felt my stomach tighten. Attachment after attachment. Financial projections, revenue forecasts, renovation summaries, expansion strategy documents. And right there, highlighted in blue, sat inflated renovation costs, nearly double what I knew the improvements had actually cost. I read the numbers twice, then a third time. Ethan had padded the expenses, not massively, not cartoonishly, just enough to create the illusion of larger infrastructure, investment, and higher future valuation. Classic startup manipulation, dangerous enough to matter, small enough to rationalize. I leaned back slowly in the chair. Leon noticed my expression instantly. When I handed him the laptop, he squinted at the spreadsheet like it personally insulted his education. I have no idea what I'm looking at. He's inflating renovation numbers. Leon blinked. Your kid's cooking the books. Not fully. That's a terrifying sentence. I rubbed my forehead. The worst part wasn't even the dishonesty. It was how predictable it felt. Ethan wasn't trying to become criminal. He was trying to become impressive. And a shocking number of bad decisions are born from that exact motivation. I scrolled farther through the email chain. That's when I noticed something else. Claire hadn't actually meant to send it to me. Autofill error. She typed G, probably searching for Graham Holloway, the investor. Instead, she accidentally sent the entire package to Garrett Butler, old man with a Gmail account. Funny how greed creates carelessness. I need you to pay attention to this next part, because this was the exact moment my emotions changed completely. Until then, I had still been operating partly like a hurt father. After that email, I started thinking like a risk analyst again, because now it wasn't just embarrassment. Ethan was building investor relationships on distorted numbers while holding a lease he barely understood inside a property with unstable ownership. That combination destroys people. Not immediately, slowly, publicly. And if things collapsed later, guess who would become the villain in Ethan's version of events? Not the consultants, not the investors, not the lawyers. Me. The old father who never believed in him. I closed the laptop carefully. Leon watched me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Your boy doesn't need enemies. He's manufacturing them himself." That line stayed with me because it was true. Ambitious people sometimes confuse admiration with trust. They think if enough people clap for them, loudly enough, reality becomes negotiable. But paperwork doesn't care about charisma. Debt doesn't care about branding. And commercial leases definitely don't care about inspirational LinkedIn posts. That night, I sat alone in my living room, looking through old family photos. Ethan, at age 7, holding a trout bigger than his arm. Ethan at 16 pretending not to smile during baseball season. Ethan helping Maggie decorate the Christmas tree before life taught him embarrassment. You know what hurts most about watching someone change? Remembering the version of them that was easier to love. Around 9:30 p.m., Ethan texted me, "Big day Thursday. Wish me luck." That was it. No invitation, no warmth, no awareness. Just another performance update sent to the man funding pieces of his survival. I stared at the message for almost a full minute before replying. Proud of you. Be careful who you trust. 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then finally, always am. I almost laughed at that. Because Ethan had no idea the most dangerous thing in his business wasn't hidden investors or unstable ownership groups. It was his own arrogance. And by then, I had officially decided something. I was going to that brunch after all, not as Ethan's father, as the man holding the keys to his building. Thursday morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of sharp Idaho morning where the air feels clean enough to expose your bad decisions. I parked the Ranger 3 blocks away from Forge and Pine because I suddenly understood why bank robbers use getaway cars. Nothing humbles a man faster than realizing he's emotionally nervous about attending his own son's business launch undercover as a landlord. Downtown Boise looked polished already. Young professionals carrying laptops crossed intersections, holding coffee cups with logos instead of names. Expensive dogs walked beside expensive people. Somewhere nearby, somebody was probably paying $14 for fermented oat milk optimism. I sat in the truck a minute longer than necessary. Gray flannel shirt, old brown jacket, clean jeans, boots polished enough not to embarrass Maggie's memory. That was the thing about my wife. Even after death, I still dressed like she might inspect me later. Before getting out, I checked my phone. One unread text from Leon. Don't commit felonies before lunch. Helpful, as always. I smiled despite myself and stepped out into the cold. Forge and Pine looked even more impressive during daylight. The front windows stretched nearly floor to ceiling, glowing warm against the November air. Inside hanging pendant lights cast soft amber circles over polished concrete floors and dark wood tables. Somebody had arranged eucalyptus branches near the entrance because apparently modern businesses are legally required to resemble expensive forest rituals now. A valet attendant stood near the curb. That irritated me immediately. Nothing says community coffee space like valet parking for men named Trevor discussing venture capital. I walked toward the entrance slowly, and I need you to understand something here. I was nervous, not about the ownership situation, about Ethan, because no matter what had happened, no matter how angry or disappointed I felt, there's still something deeply painful about entering a room where your own child might not want you. The second I stepped inside, I smelled espresso cinnamon pastries and expensive cologne. Music floated softly through hidden speakers. People laughed in polished business voices. And there was Ethan, standing near the center of the room, wearing a tailored navy blazer, dark jeans, and the kind of confident smile people practice in bathroom mirrors before networking events. For a second, I just watched him. He looked successful. That's what hit me hardest. Not fake successful, actually successful. People gathered around him naturally. Investors leaned in when he spoke. Employees moved faster when he glanced their direction. My son had built something real, which somehow made the betrayal hurt even worse. Then Ethan looked up and saw me. You know that split second when somebody's real emotions escape before their social mask catches up? I saw all of it. Shock, confusion, panic, then calculation. The whole sequence happened in maybe one heartbeat. He recovered fast, too fast. Dad nearby conversations softened slightly as a few people turned toward us. I smiled calmly. Morning, kid. Ethan walked over quickly, lowering his voice immediately. What are you doing here? Now that sentence right there tells you everything. Not, I'm glad you came. Not, you made it. Just immediate damage control. I kept my tone gentle. Thought I'd see the place. He glanced around the room nervously. Well, yeah. Okay. He stopped himself. Because saying you weren't invited out loud in public would have made him look exactly like the kind of son he secretly was becoming. Claire appeared beside him, then wearing a cream-colored coat and gold earrings. Maggie would have complimented immediately. The second Claire saw me, her face softened. Garrett, she said warmly. You came. Interesting. Not, what are you doing here? Claire looked genuinely relieved. That told me more than she realized. I hugged her lightly. Wouldn't miss seeing all this. And I meant that too, because despite everything, I was proud of the work. Then Ethan did something that lodged itself permanently in my memory. A silver-haired investor approached us holding champagne. Ethan. The man said, "You going to introduce us?" And my son smiled professionally before saying, "This is Garrett, family friend from Spokane. Family friend. Now listen, I've lived through layoffs, funerals, debt surgeries, and one unforgettable Thanksgiving where Leon accidentally deep-fried a turkey under a patio awning. But I don't think anything has ever hit me quite like hearing my own son reduce me to family friend because I didn't fit the image he wanted in the room." Claire's eyes widened slightly the second he said it. She noticed. Good people usually do. I looked at Ethan for one long, quiet second. Then I smiled. Something like that. The investor shook my hand absent-mindedly before turning immediately back toward Ethan. That's the funny thing about wealthy people sometimes. If your jacket costs under $200, they unconsciously begin searching the room for someone more financially symmetrical. Ethan guided them away quickly. I stood there alone beside the pastry table, pretending to examine croissants, while my chest quietly broke itself apart. And here's the worst part. A piece of me still understood why he did it. That's what children never realize about parents. We often understand the cruelty being used against us in painful detail. Ethan was ashamed of appearing small, ashamed of seeming connected to ordinary people. And I represented ordinary better than almost anybody in that room. I grabbed coffee mostly to give my hands something to do. A younger employee behind the counter smiled politely. Dark roast, please. You here for the investor brunch, sort of. She handed me the cup. Mr. Butler's been going nonstop all week. He barely slept. I nodded quietly. Sounds like him. The employee grinned. He talks about expanding already. Another Boise location, maybe. Maybe Seattle eventually. Of course he did. Expansion before stabilization. Classic ambition. Addiction. As the morning continued, I moved quietly around the edges of the room, listening. And Ethan kept talking. That's the problem with arrogant people. Once they start performing confidence publicly, they usually can't stop. I heard him discussing future valuation, brand scalability, regional growth strategy. At one point, he even gestured toward the ceiling beams, saying, "We locked down the building structure long term. No sun. You leased it long term." Different thing entirely. Richard Holloway eventually arrived around 11:20. Tall, expensive watch. Perfect haircut. The kind of businessman who says circling back in emails like it's a military operation. He shook Ethan's hand aggressively while scanning the room for profitable humans. Then his eyes landed on me. Noticed the flannel, the old jacket, the ordinary coffee cup, and instantly categorized me as socially irrelevant. You know that look. Rich people sometimes give older, working-class men, like we wandered in accidentally while trying to find a hardware store. That look. Richard nodded politely. Bare minimum politeness. Then turned away before I even finished introducing myself. Honestly, that part didn't bother me much. I'd spent decades around men exactly like him. Men who mistake simplicity for lack of intelligence. Those are usually the easiest men to surprise. By then, Ethan had fully settled back into performance mode, laughing loudly, moving confidently, telling carefully edited stories about building from nothing. Every sentence pushed farther away from truth, and every lie made the room feel tighter around my ribs. Then finally, around 11:45, Ethan stepped toward the center of the space, holding a champagne glass. Conversations quieted. Employees smiled nervously. Investors turned toward him. And my son lifted the glass slightly before speaking 7 words I still remember perfectly. I built this without anyone's handouts. I built this without anyone's handouts. The room applauded. That's the part people never tell you about lies. If they're polished enough, they sound inspirational at first. Champagne glasses lifted. Somebody near the front shouted, "Hell yeah!" Richard Holloway nodded approvingly like he'd personally invented hard work. And I just stood there holding a paper coffee cup while those 7 words moved through my chest like broken glass. Because suddenly, I could see everything at once. Maggie working double shifts at Sacred Heart with swollen feet. Me missing fishing trips because overtime mattered more than weekends. The $42,000 wired quietly from savings built over decades. Every Christmas, where Ethan received ifsins, while Maggie and I quietly skipped buying things for ourselves. And there he stood, telling strangers he had done it alone. Now listen carefully. The reason betrayal hurts so deeply isn't because somebody forgot what you did for them. It's because they remembered and decided your contribution damaged the story they wanted to tell about themselves. Ethan smiled while applause faded around him. I mean that sincerely, he continued. Forge and Pine exists because we took risks and believed in our own vision. We. Interesting how we appears when praise arrives, but disappears when bills do. Claire stood near the espresso bar, watching him carefully now. You could already see tiny cracks forming in her expression. Not outrage yet, just confusion. Because good people eventually notice when confidence starts sounding rehearsed. Ethan continued speaking. We've already started discussions about expansion opportunities in neighboring markets. Expansion, of course. The business wasn't even stable yet, and he was already selling imaginary future locations to investors. That's startup culture sometimes. Everybody acts like they're 3 TED Talks away from becoming a billionaire while secretly eating antacids in parking lots. A few people laughed as Ethan told some cleaned up story about bootstrapping the impossible. And then my son looked directly at Richard Holloway and said, "We secured the building structure early, which gave us a huge advantage moving forward." That sentence finally pushed something in me from hurt into clarity. Because no, Ethan, you didn't secure anything. You signed papers you barely understood. There's a difference. I took one slow sip of coffee. Cold already. Typical. Richard raised his champagne glass slightly. "That's what separates real entrepreneurs," he announced loudly. "Ownership mindset." Oh, the irony nearly killed me right there. I actually had to look down for a second to stop myself from laughing. You know those moments where reality becomes so absurd, it circles all the way back around into comedy. Meanwhile, Ethan kept going. "Our long-term lease position gives us leverage for future equity conversations." Now that sentence got my attention because leverage based on lease positioning only works if ownership approval structures remain stable. And Ethan clearly had no idea what he was publicly implying in front of investors. Worse, Richard looked impressed. I set the coffee cup down slowly. Claire approached Ethan quietly while others clapped again. I couldn't hear her fully over the room noise, but I caught pieces. Maybe don't overstate. Ethan smiled tightly without looking at her. "It's fine. Not, thank you. Not, I understand. Just, it's fine." That tiny exchange told me everything. Claire already knew he was stretching the truth, and Ethan already believed charisma could outrun consequences. Dangerous combination. Then Richard turned toward me unexpectedly. "So, Garrett," he said casually, "what line of work were you in?" Past tense. Always funny when wealthy people speak to retirees like we were historical weather events. I smiled politely. "Commercial property risk assessment mostly." Richard nodded absent-mindedly. "Ah, that was it. Just ah." No follow-up question. Because he assumed flannel plus retirement plus ordinary truck equals irrelevant old man. Again, easiest kind of person to surprise. Ethan shifted slightly beside him. I noticed it immediately. Nervous. Not because he thought I'd expose him, because he didn't want me talking too long in front of these people. The same way teenagers panic when parents accidentally reveal childhood stories in public. Only this time, the childhood story was your entire lease structure is more fragile than you realize. Richard kept talking. "We're looking at helping Ethan scale this concept regionally." Scale. That word again. Everybody wanted bigger, faster, more. Nobody in the room seemed remotely interested in stability. I glanced around the space slowly. Employees smiling nervously. Investors calculating silently. Young professionals networking aggressively beside artisanal pastries. And right in the center of it all stood my son, pretending he had arrived here independently. You know what finally pushed me over the edge emotionally? Not the money. Not even the lies. It was the arrogance. Because arrogance blinds people to the very hands holding them up. And eventually, Gravity notices. I cleared my throat lightly. Question. The room quieted slightly. Ethan's eyes moved toward me immediately. Careful now. Alert. I kept my voice calm. You mentioned future expansion based on your lease positioning. Ethan forced a smile. Right. You already received landlord approval for those assumptions. Silence. Tiny silence. But enough. Richard looked between us. Claire's face changed instantly, and Ethan laughed a little too quickly. Well, obviously there are future discussions involved. I nodded slowly. Because commercial landlords can get particular about subleasing structures, equity, positioning, improvement, reimbursement clauses. I let the sentence drift off casually. Richard frowned faintly now, finally interested. Ethan's smile tightened. We've got it handled. There's that word again. Handled. People say handled when they mean, please stop asking questions in front of witnesses. I looked directly at Ethan. For your sake, I hope so. The room temperature changed after that. Not dramatically, subtly, like everybody suddenly sensed a conversation happening underneath the visible conversation. Richard studied me more carefully now. Claire looked openly uncomfortable. And Ethan looked irritated. Not scared yet, just annoyed that the old family friend from Spokane was complicating the performance. Then his phone buzzed. He checked it quickly, and for the first time all morning, genuine confusion crossed his face. I noticed immediately. So did Claire. What did she ask softly? Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Because Ethan checked the message twice, then scanned the room, then looked toward the front entrance. That's when I knew Vanessa had arrived, right on time. I didn't turn immediately. I just stood there calmly while the entire emotional weight of the morning settled quietly into place around us. You know what's funny? Revenge in movies always looks dramatic. Explosions, screaming, big speeches. Real revenge, the kind built from paperwork. And patience is much quieter. It's watching somebody slowly realize the room they thought they controlled actually belongs to someone else. I finally looked toward the glass entrance doors, and there she was, Vanessa Cole. Navy coat, blue document folder tucked under one arm, professional expression locked firmly into place. The second Ethan saw her clearly color drained from his face so fast it almost looked painful. Claire noticed immediately. Richard noticed too. And that was the exact moment the energy inside Forge and Pine changed permanently. Because suddenly, my son understood something was wrong. Very wrong. He just didn't know yet that the man he introduced as a family friend from Spokane was about to become the most important person in the building. And that was the moment the room stopped belonging to Ethan. Vanessa walked through the front doors with the calm expression of someone carrying paperwork capable of ruining brunch. Honestly, I've always respected that energy. The room quieted gradually as she crossed the polished concrete floor. Her heels clicked softly beneath the low music, while conversation stumbled and restarted around her. Ethan moved toward her immediately. Too fast. That's the thing about panic. It speeds people up before they realize everyone can see it. Vanessa, he said quietly, forcing a smile. Hey, I didn't know you were coming. I wasn't invited, she replied politely. That almost made me laugh. Claire folded her arms slowly beside the espresso bar. Richard Holloway watched the interaction with growing interest. Now investor instincts finally waking up. Men like Richard can smell instability the same way sharks smell blood. Vanessa glanced toward me briefly. Professional, controlled. Then she looked back at Ethan. I needed to deliver updated ownership documentation. There it was. Not loud, not dramatic, just one sentence. And suddenly, the air inside Forge and Pine changed temperature. Ethan blinked once. What Vanessa held the blue folder against her side. The property ownership transfer finalized Monday afternoon. Now listen carefully. Most people don't understand commercial real estate language well enough to panic immediately. But Ethan did. At least enough. I watched realization begin moving across his face, piece by piece, like storm clouds rolling over water. Wait, he said carefully. What transfer? Richard stepped closer. Claire, too. A few nearby investors stopped pretending not to listen. Vanessa opened the folder calmly. The building located at 412 West Idaho Street has officially transferred ownership under Butler Basin Holdings, LLC, effective Monday, 3:47 p.m. Silence. Real silence this time. Not social silence. Shock silence. And then Ethan made the exact mistake arrogant people always make first. He looked at Richard, not me. Because even then, some part of his brain still assumed or power belonged to wealthier-looking men. Richard frowned immediately. I wasn't informed about this. Vanessa remained perfectly composed. Tenant notifications were scheduled this week. Claire spoke softly. Who owns Butler Basin Holdings? And that's when Vanessa finally turned toward me. Every eye in the room followed hers. I set my coffee cup down carefully on a nearby table. You're looking at him, I said. You could actually feel the room react. Like oxygen changed density. Ethan stared at me blankly for a second. Not understanding, then understanding all at once. No, he said quietly. I nodded once. Yes. His face lost color so fast it genuinely scared me for half a second. Now here's the strange part. I expected satisfaction, victory, something cinematic. Instead, what I mostly felt was sadness. Because beneath all the anger and betrayal and quiet revenge stood one unavoidable truth. I had just publicly humiliated my own son. Even if he deserved it. Even if he built the moment himself. That still hurts. Ethan laughed suddenly, short, disbelieving. You're joking. I'm not. You bought the building controlling ownership position, yes. Claire looked between us in complete confusion now. Richard's expression shifted rapidly from annoyance to calculation. And Ethan looked like somebody had kicked a hole straight through the version of reality he'd been selling himself. How he asked. Now that question right there nearly broke my heart. Because after everything I'd done for him, after decades of work, after 32 years analyzing commercial property structures, my own son still couldn't imagine I was capable of something financially significant. I kept my voice calm. The same way I spent most of my adult life doing things, Ethan. Quietly. Nobody moved. Nobody even pretended to sip champagne anymore. Vanessa handed me the folder. I opened it slowly, while Ethan stared at me like he no longer recognized my face. Then I pulled out a copy of the lease agreement. His lease agreement. You signed a 5-year personal guarantee, I said evenly. Late payment penalties begin after 60 days. Tenant improvement disclosures require accurate investor-facing financial representation. Richard's head turned immediately toward Ethan. Claire's eyes widened, and there it was. Fear. Real fear this time. Not embarrassment, not irritation. Consequences. Ethan lowered his voice sharply. Dad not here. You made this here. That line landed harder than I intended. I saw it immediately in his expression. But it was true. Every single piece of this moment had been built by Ethan himself. The lies, the arrogance, the performance, the exclusion. I wasn't destroying his illusion. I was interrupting it. Richard stepped forward. What exactly are you implying about financial representation, investor mode fully activated now? Predator calm. Ethan turned immediately defensive. Nothing illegal happened. Interesting choice of wording. Claire looked at him sharply. Illegal. Wrong word, son. Never volunteer legal vocabulary around investors. I sighed quietly. You inflated renovation projections in investor materials. Claire froze. Richard's expression hardened instantly. Ethan looked at me with pure disbelief now. How did you even... The email was sent to me accidentally. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Oh my God. Now listen. This next part mattered more than the ownership reveal. Because this was where Ethan finally understood the real danger. Wasn't my anger. It was his own carelessness. I stepped closer to him, slightly lowering my voice enough that only nearby people could hear clearly. You wanted so badly to look successful that you stopped respecting the difference between presentation and truth. Ethan shook his head immediately. You don't understand how these businesses work. No, I said calmly. You don't understand how collapse works. That hit him hard, because suddenly I wasn't old anymore in his eyes. I was experienced. And those are not the same thing. Claire looked devastated now. Not because of the ownership issue, because she was realizing Ethan had been lying in layers. To investors, to her, to himself. Richard adjusted his watch slowly. I think perhaps we should revisit future discussions at another time. Translation: I am leaving before this becomes subpoena adjacent. He nodded stiffly toward Ethan, then toward me. And just like that, the most important investor in the room began backing away from the deal. Ethan noticed immediately. Panic flashed across his face. Richard, wait. But Richard was already gone. Funny how fast powerful people disappear when risk stops looking fashionable. The room had fully shifted now. Guests whispered quietly. Employees avoided eye contact. Somebody turned the music volume lower without being asked. Claire finally looked directly at Ethan. Were you ever going to tell me any of this? He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. And honestly, that was the moment that hurt most. Because beneath all the business chaos stood a scared little boy who still thought image mattered more than honesty. I looked at him for a long time before speaking again. You dressed like a CEO before learning how to be a man. Dead silence. Even Vanessa looked down after that one. Ethan stared at me with wet eyes he clearly hated having in public. You wanted to embarrass me, he whispered. And there it was, the final misunderstanding. I shook my head slowly. No, Ethan. I looked around the beautiful space he had built. The lights, the tables, the employees, the dream. Then back at my son. I wanted you to stop humiliating yourself. People think revenge ends when the room goes quiet. It doesn't. That's usually when the damage finally starts speaking. The brunch ended the way most disasters do. Quietly. No explosions. No dramatic screaming. Just expensive people leaving early while pretending they had somewhere else important to be. Within 20 minutes, Forge and Pine went from the hottest new business launch in Boise to a room full of half-finished champagne glasses and employees aggressively avoiding eye contact. That's another thing nobody tells you about humiliation. The audience disappears fast. I stood near the front windows watching snow begin drifting lightly across downtown Boise, while Ethan remained frozen beside the espresso bar like his body had temporarily forgotten how movement worked. Claire was the first person to speak. Not to me, to Ethan. How long, she asked quietly. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. Claire, how long have you been lying? Now listen carefully. People think relationships collapse because of one giant betrayal. Usually they collapse from accumulated evasions finally becoming visible all at once. Claire wasn't crying yet. Honestly, that made it worse. She just looked tired. Tired in the way people get when they suddenly realize they've been carrying trust for two people. I didn't lie, Ethan said weakly. And there it was. The final desperate defense of every intelligent person caught in their own nonsense. Technically worded denial. Claire laughed once without humor. You introduced your father as a family friend. That landed harder than anything I'd said all morning. Because she was right. Forget the lease. Forget the investors. Forget the inflated projections. That single sentence exposed the real sickness underneath everything else. Shame. Ethan looked down at the polished concrete floor, and for the first time since I'd arrived, he looked young again. Not ambitious, not polished, just young. Vanessa quietly gathered her paperwork near the entrance while employees began cleaning tables in nervous silence. I walked toward Ethan slowly. He still wouldn't look at me. Part of me wanted him to. Part of me was relieved he didn't. You should go after Claire, I said gently. She won't answer. You don't know that. She should hate me. I sighed softly. That's not how love works. Claire grabbed her coat from the back office area and paused near the front doors. Before leaving, she looked at me instead of Ethan. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Now that nearly broke me, because she had nothing to apologize for. I nodded once. You deserved honesty. Then she looked toward Ethan one last time and walked out into the snow. The sound of the door closing echoed through the emptying café. Ethan sat down heavily at one of the tables, hands shaking slightly now. That surprised me, not because he was emotional, because Ethan hated appearing emotional in front of people. Always had. Even as a kid. When he was 10 years old, he broke his wrist riding a bike downhill too fast near Manito Park. The doctor asked his pain level, and Ethan said manageable while tears streamed down his face. That's who he was. Pain became something to negotiate instead of feel. I finally sat across from him. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan asked quietly, "Are you going to take the building away from me? straight to the fear underneath everything. I shook my head immediately. No. He looked up finally, confused. Then why did you do this? That question deserved an honest answer. So I gave him one. Because I was watching you become somebody I don't think even you liked very much. Silence. Outside, snow continued falling softly across downtown Boise while employees cleaned up what remained of the launch event. I folded my hands together slowly. You built something beautiful here, Ethan. His eyes watered again instantly. But you started confusing success with performance. He looked away. You don't understand how hard this was. No, I said softly. I understand exactly how hard it was. And I did. That was the tragedy of it. I understood his hunger, his insecurity, his obsession with proving himself. Because I'd felt all of it too once. Just differently. I spent most of my life terrified of not being enough, I admitted quietly. Difference is, I never learned to be ashamed of the people who helped me survive it. That one hurt him. I could see it. Good. Some truths are supposed to hurt before they heal anything. About an hour later, after Vanessa finished reviewing the formal ownership transition documents with him privately, the reality became unavoidable. The building belonged to Butler Basin Holdings, me. Technically, Ethan still had a fully enforceable lease. But now, every future financial move required transparency. No hidden projections, no inflated positioning, no expansion promises built on imaginary leverage. Just honest business. Which ironically was the first truly stable thing Forge and Pine had experienced since opening. Over the next several weeks, things got messy. Richard Holloway officially backed out. 2 smaller investors followed him. Claire moved into her sister's apartment temporarily. And Ethan stopped posting motivational business quotes online, which, honestly, may have been the healthiest development of all. Now you might think this is where I crushed him financially. Raised rent, threatened eviction, punished him. I didn't. Because despite everything, I still remembered who Ethan used to be before fear and ego started wearing expensive shoes. Instead, I restructured portions of the lease, reduced immediate pressure, created a realistic repayment schedule for the $42,000, required full accounting transparency, and most importantly, I forced him to slow down. No second location, no expansion, no investor pitches, just one business, one honest business. Turns out humility improves accounting dramatically. Around February, Ethan drove up to Spokane unexpectedly. No blazer this time, no performance voice, just jeans, tired eyes, and a paper bag from Frank's Diner sitting on my porch. Leon said you'd probably be home, he muttered. That man weaponizes gossip. Ethan gave a weak laugh, then held up the bag. Brought cinnamon rolls. That's how men in my family apologize sometimes, through carbohydrates. We sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee while snow piled against the windows outside. And eventually, Ethan said the thing I'd been waiting months to hear. I was embarrassed of you. Honest. Finally, honest. He swallowed hard before continuing. You reminded me of everything I was scared of becoming. Now listen, that sentence hurt deeply, but weirdly, it also healed something, because at least it was true. and truth gives people somewhere real to stand again. I looked down at Maggie's old sunflower patterned mug in my hands. You know what the funny part is, I asked. What I was proud of you, even when you were becoming impossible to like. That broke him completely. He cried quietly at my kitchen table at 39 years old while snow fell outside and Leon's ridiculous cinnamon rolls went cold between us. And honestly, so did I. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Even 6 months later, things still felt fragile sometimes. Claire eventually came back cautiously. Forge and Pine survived but smaller, more honest, less glamorous, which probably saved it. Ethan and I started having breakfast together once a month whenever I drove through Boise. Some mornings, conversation came easy. Other mornings, it didn't. That's real healing, by the way. Not movie healing. Real healing is awkward and uneven and occasionally quiet, but it's real. And if there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. Never become so desperate to look successful that you start erasing the people who carried you when nobody else would. Pride is expensive. Image is temporary. And the people who love you quietly are usually worth more than the applause of strangers. Sometimes the strongest people in your life are the ones wearing old flannel shirts, driving rusty trucks, and saying very little while protecting you in ways you don't even notice yet. If this story meant something to you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been in a situation like this? We read every single one. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.